Charmaine Husum is an artist, a Kundalini yoga teacher, and is trained in the somatic approach of integrative body psychotherapy, as well as Reiki. Center of the Heart is Charmaine's private art therapy and counseling practice, which operates on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Nakota Nations, and the Métis people of Calgary, Alberta, Canada. In this practice, she sees clients in person and online, both regionally and internationally. Her current research passions are in neuroplasticity, neuroscience, epigenetics, mystical and psychedelic integration, and intergenerational trauma. She is currently writing a book and creating online courses and programs. So joining us today is Charmaine Husum. Welcome, Charmaine. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Jen. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're very grateful for your time and your wisdom. Thank you for sharing it with our psychedelic support community. I want to jump right in and get to ask you, so our psychedelic support community is continuing to grow as more and more people learn about the importance of integration, which is a really big conversation point in psychedelic medicine. And I know it's something that you focus on a great deal in your practice. I'm wondering if you can share with our community what integration is and why it plays such a key role in healing.
Yes, thank you. It does play a key role in healing, is what I believe, absolutely. And it is the focus of my work. I work as an integration specialist. I'm an art therapist and somatic practitioner. So one of the key reasons I find integration is important when using psychedelics is that there needs to be a container to hold the space and the experience. And when we look at the history of psychedelics, and especially plant medicines being used in indigenous cultures, they already have that container. They have that community. Oftentimes these medicines are well known to people before they use them, and they can connect with loved ones afterwards to explore their experience and to learn more from it. So in the Western cultures, if we say fly down to South America and partake in a ceremony or somewhere, then we end up coming back to our home, back to our place. And there may have been, a small integration circle afterwards, but the effects of the medicine can sometimes wear off, which creates the need to go back for more. Or what can sometimes happen is that we've had such an awakening, a blast, that when we come back home, we just need to change everything in life, which can sometimes be very disruptive. So I find integration to be super important because I believe the psychedelic experience is not necessarily a cure to what's happening for someone when someone is seeking out psychedelics for medicinal healing, but rather an opening for deeper awarenesses, for deeper understandings, and for deeper healing to take place. So I also, another piece of integration I feel is important, but it's not necessarily important for everyone. So it depends on who I'm working with, but that is connecting with the spirit of the medicine that was used. So obviously, if we're working with plant medicines, that's quite different than working with medicines that are created in a lab. But I find when working with clients that to connect to the memory and the spirit of the medicine to use as a resource as they move through life and continue the healing growth is super supportive. And even years after an experience, I have even personally experienced tapping into the spirit of that medicine, of that healing. And if that doesn't align with someone's worldview, the idea too could be just tapping into the memory of the experience of healing. That being said, not all psychedelic experiences are pleasant. In fact, when we're working with some of the more intense psychedelics, say like iboga or ayahuasca, it can be very dysregulating. And so for that reason, integration can be extremely important to make sense of what happened. Because like I said, I believe that kind of a door opens, healing opens, and that's when we start to do the work, is through the integration. Another piece and reason integration I find is really important is the reason that some people might use psychedelics for healing. So it's one thing to use psychedelics to kind of expand consciousness, but it's entirely different if one is using psychedelics for healing, and especially for psychological healing. So oftentimes people have experienced trauma in their lives, and that brings them to the point of wanting change, wanting something different. And so psychedelics may be a last resort. So going through a ceremony or a session, whether that even be ketamine or in a doctor's office with the perfect set and setting, it's just the beginning. It's just kind of ripping the Band-Aid off, and then the work gets done. So those are some pieces why I feel integration is so important in using these medicines for healing.
That is so beautifully shared. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate you sharing not only like the positive pieces of how these medicines can be deeply enriching, and how also these more difficult parts of experiences need to be held too and need to be integrated too. And there's healing in that as well. And we really kind of get the whole spectrum when folks are working with plant medicines. I would love to get to ask how you approach integration in your own practice.
Yeah, thank you. So in my practice, above all, what's most important to me in my approach is to be trauma-informed. And so it's a common buzzword these days, trauma-informed, but it's very specific in its meaning, and it also requires training to fully understand and be able to hold a trauma-informed space, in my opinion. Sometimes being trauma-informed, it can be misunderstood that one must experience a severe trauma to have trauma. But really, when we're working with people, we really don't know, right? Especially if we're working with large groups. And also with, now we now have current research into the brain and neuroplasticity and epigenetics that trauma affects everyone differently, and different traumas affect people differently. So what may seem like something minor could be actually a huge trigger. So what trauma-informed means for me then is the way of holding space. It can be the way of speaking to people, even the words that are sometimes used can be triggering. So what we're working to do is hold a space that feels safe and comfortable, where people are not triggered. Sometimes being in a room of 50 people, all experiencing an altered state of consciousness, whether that be through psychedelics or breath work or whatever, even a yoga class, can be horrifically triggering and re-traumatizing. So definitely one of the most important approaches in the work I do is to be trauma-informed. So another way that I approach integration is client-centered or person-centered. So what this means is I follow the client's lead in what they're needing. So in working as a trauma-informed therapist, trauma-informed art therapist and counselor, I believe that true healing lives within everybody. So in order to access that, a client needs to access that on their own. I'm here as a guide, but I don't believe in a hierarchical structure within therapy. I may suggest or support moving in different directions, but it's important for me that it's always client-led and person-centered in the approach. And another way I work is transpersonally, as I mentioned earlier. And again, it depends on who I'm working with, if that's true for them. If I'm working with someone who's an atheist, then we're probably not going to speak about spirits or the spirit of medicine still being with them. But I would approach it in a different way of what they feel connected to in the world. And so working transpersonally with the medicine and with people in general can be working with their worldview. So I find it super supportive if someone believes in something larger than themselves, and we incorporate that into the work we do for when extra support is needed, especially because I work with mainly with trauma and people who've experienced trauma. first and foremost is finding safety. And so sometimes an easy way to access that is to tap into something that's larger than themselves that they can feel as a resource and a support. And another way that I approach integration in my practice is through psychoeducation. I am fascinated with neuroscience and neuroplasticity, how things are happening in the brain and changing in the brain, both when we're using psychedelics, but also through meditation and through art making. I'm an art therapist, so I often explain to people how we're rerouting neural pathways in the brain in the work we're doing. And ultimately, this is to increase the neurotransmitters in the brain, the neurochemicals in the brain, to deliver more serotonin and dopamine and oxytocin and all these good feelings. So I believe that when people know what's happening, that they feel there's a greater sense of control. And because I work in the areas of PTSD and complex PTSD and trauma, what's often happened is control has been taken away from someone. So it's in sessions that we work to find control in whatever way that looks. Often that is finding that inner control. And by knowing what's actually happening in our brains, it helps people to make sense of the processes that are going on.
Thank you for that. It's so powerful to hear you speak about being trauma informed and what that truly means. How do you really bring that to life when it is such a common phrase and buzzword, like you said, at the moment? And there's also a lot that it takes to hold that space well. It makes me think of another common phrase that we hear in this field a lot called harm reduction. I know many people who are in the community have heard this phrase before, learning about how they can make things safer or less harmful. Never obviously 100% safe, as no one can guarantee that. But I wanted to ask about your thoughts on how we can practice harm reduction when it comes to this kind of psychedelic healing. What are some of the risks that you've seen, and how do you reduce harm in your own practice?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. That's a really important question. Such an important question, and it can sometimes be overlooked in ways when we're speaking about psychedelics and using psychedelics, because ultimately psychedelics are seen as non-addictive, right? The more we take them the next day and the next day, well, they just become less potent. So although they're seen as less addictive, what is addictive is seeking out heightened experiences. And that is definitely something I've seen quite a bit, and not just for myself, but other colleagues and psychologists and counselors that I work with, is people returning to the medicine over and over again to get back to that feeling of connection, of healing. And that's actually the reason why I got into integration work in the first place, was just noticing this need, speaking to people who said they were on their 100th ceremony, like for using ayahuasca, or would use mushrooms every weekend, or acid. And it's if it's someone's choice to expand their consciousness and they want to do that, that's great. That's their choice. But when we're speaking of using psychedelics for medicinal purposes, and especially for psychological healing, I feel it's important to create a container and a space and an understanding where we use the psychedelics for healing with a harm reduction lens. We use it to open something up, and then we do our personal work, because we can't keep going back and going back, because what that will do, in my opinion, and what I've seen with clients too, is it creates that desire for heightened experiences, which may be psychedelics at first, but it can also transition into other areas of life, or other things in life where we're seeking excitement in ways that can become dangerous as well. So ultimately, we're working to integrate the medicine into the person for full actualization of that healing self, that capacity of self, for resiliency, and moving from a place of survival into a place of thriving eventually. I have created an online program for this. I work with people using these 3 stages of trauma therapy, which was first outlined by Judith Herman in 1992, and Bessel van der Kolk uses this quite a bit too, where we're working through 3 different stages, and pacing that too. So we're creating safety to begin with. Then we may be tapping into the experience, and that can be tapping into an experience of trauma. But it's never that the trauma needs to be spoken about, or even the experience of the medicine needs to be spoken about, but what the effects were, so what the symptoms are. And then finally, we move into connecting with our community, our friends, and just allowing more human connection. So that's one thing I wanted to say about harm reduction. And yeah, I guess like just how do we create this lasting healing to take place, to take hold within the body? It's my belief. Definitely, there's other pieces around harm reduction when using psychedelics. I'm not a doctor, but I would, and I don't do psychedelic therapy with people. I do integration, pre and post integration, and support for those working through their experience. But I do find it's important to know if someone's been using any other medications. The contraindications with some, say, antidepressants, and especially ayahuasca, can be deadly. So it's really important when we're speaking about harm reduction to know what kind of medications are being used. And I do feel that it would be nice for the medical community to be more involved in a way, right? So these medicines can become legitimized as healing medicines and can be supported by the medical community. So, maybe blood tests are done, or I'm not sure what that looks like. And it's always kind of confusing when we speak about legitimizing or regulating these medicines, because especially working with plant medicines, what can be dangerous, and something I thought I wrote down here was regulation is a scary term, because within that means the sticky fingers of corporate pharmaceutical giants. So I'm not sure what it looks like, but what I am seeing more and more of is these medicines being used in a way that creates a business and makes money, and where people aren't the focus, right? And I think that's quite different from what Indigenous tribes initially used these medicines as. And so I have been to ceremonies where I would feel there was too many people and there wasn't enough support for others. And also in who is holding that space, right? That they're well trained, that there's some kind of regulation and credentials with who is holding these spaces for healing, can also support harm reduction. I've encountered a lot of people who have had awful experiences. And some of them, in the jungle, some of them even here in Canada and the States. But there's a lot of people claiming to be shamans or claiming to hold safe spaces for this medicine or for psychedelics with maybe not the best intentions. So there's quite a few different ways we can look at harm reduction, but those are some of the key points that stand out for me.
Thank you for sharing that. I couldn't agree more. I think there is so much here where we have to be cautious and intentional, because there is so much interest, because there are so many different voices and also companies and people of all, with all different intentions who are stepping into the space. So it really, I think the call for safety is becoming louder and louder in the community, and obviously has been a part of Indigenous practice for all of human history, and is something that I think in the Western space we're just beginning to relearn, hopefully under Indigenous leadership and guidance. And so I'm grateful for you naming the many aspects of harm reduction. There's some that are person to person, but there's some that are really at this systematic level that we have to be thinking about too. So I always am grateful for that conversation to come forward in these spaces. Mm-hmm. And I I want to get to ask intentionally about a part of your work we haven't talked about in depth yet, which is, your practice as an art therapist. And I wonder if you could share more about, in the safe spaces you create, how creativity plays a role in the healing that you help facilitate within your practice.
Yeah, well, it's a big part of the work I do. Obviously, I'm an art therapist, and so what that means and what I do is, well, there's different ways working with art, and so when we think of making art, a lot of people think, oh yeah, it feels nice to make art, and it's true. Art is therapeutic, which would be different from art therapy. So the way I work with people in session is often we'll start out spontaneously. So it's easy for us to move into our head and think about what we're creating. So like I mentioned earlier, I use a somatic approach. I use meditation and mindfulness in my practice as well. So I will invite people to guide them through a meditation to tap into sensations in the body. And the way I explain it is that we're allowing the unconscious to speak. So the reason we use art and therapy, or one of the reasons we use art and therapy, is because it allows the process of healing and expression to evolve from an unconscious place. So oftentimes we don't know what's going on, right? We might feel like, oh, something's going on in my life. I'm feeling this way. Everything's crashing in. I don't know why. And so when we're using, and that's just one example, but when we're using the art and coming from a mindful place, so after a meditation, allowing someone to just look at all the materials in front of them, grabbing whatever material stands out and begin moving the material on the paper. I'm always very clear that we're not making beautiful art, right? We're expressing our feelings, and oftentimes they're not that beautiful, right? So I invite people to just create whatever comes out, and just taking a moment as they create to become very mindfully aware of the sound of the material, of the feelings, of any memories or sensations or thoughts that are coming up as they're creating. Once they feel that they're finished, we process the art. And so what that means is we will discuss what is being seen. So we're not interpreting. We don't interpret the art. That's my approach anyways. We don't interpret the art at this point. In fact, I would never interpret the art. It's always the client that interprets the art because I work client-centered. But what I do invite is reflection on maybe thoughts, feelings, what do they see specifically, like if there's a red box, not explaining to me what a red box means, but just what is it? It's a red box. And then from there, I'll move someone into maybe associations and metaphors connected to different parts of the art, which can help open up an exploration of things that may not have been spoken about, may not have even been known about. But it also creates extra safety. So if one is just telling you what's happening, there's an intensity to it. But when we can move those feelings onto paper in front of us and now speak about what's in front of us rather than what's inside of us, it creates not only a different vantage point, but a different understanding and lens and some distance to it too. So there's less intensity. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll invite them to maybe change. If they wanted to change the art, maybe the art needs something else. We may ask it if it has any messages, if there's any messages within the art after we process to see what else is living in there. And then always what's also just as important is what do we do with the art afterwards. So in my practice here, if I'm working with people in my studio, I always have a folder for them where they can just store their art here, or people are welcome to take their art home, or when I'm working online with people, I remind them to put the art in a place that feels safe and contained. If it's something that's very activating, we don't want that just laying around the house. Or if it's something really resourceful, we might want to put it on the wall, like, oh yeah, my image over there, to remind us of a strength and a power within. So yeah, that's some of the ways that creativity play a role in my healing approach. But like I said, I do believe that it's the unconscious coming forward, and then when we're tapping into this power, it knows what needs to come forward. So I invite people to trust the process, follow the process, and know that that inner knowing, that intuitive place, that place where our soul lives, is guiding this process, and they're safe and contained. We may need to do some safety exercises before that, right? It's not always that we just jump into making art. Often we'll work with resource images to begin with. And then another way that creativity plays a big role in both the integration work I do and my art therapy practice is using sacred geometry, which has always been a passion of mine, and just observing, understanding the way that sacred geometry lives in our world, how it is all around us, how we are geometric beings, our DNA is geometric, our cells are geometric. And we're also connected to such a larger whole, right? Our Earth is a circle. We are within the circle, and our Earth is within the solar system, which is a circle, right? There's all these circles and fractions and equations that are all around us that I find really give a lot of grounding to the work I do with people. What it also does is, and definitely more research needs to be done on this because it is fascinating what's happening to the brain when we're making sacred geometry. And ultimately, just when we're making art, we're utilizing both the left and right hemisphere of the brain, activating the corpus callosum of the brain to integrate both hemispheres of the brain. We want to be working with both hemispheres, right? It's very important. And so I know personally for me, when I create sacred geometry, and I've been working as an artist as well for like 25 years. So, and working with these images, something happens in my body that I feel, and I feel it in my brain. I feel my parasympathetic nervous system engaged, a deep relaxation, and a deep connection to the world outside of me. I might not work with use sacred geometry with everybody in session because it can bring up some frustrations too if it doesn't look exactly the way we want it. And that is not what art therapy is. It's not about beautiful art. But what it does open up is this opening and a capacity for self-acceptance. So when we say I teach some different workshops on different sacred geometry lessons, and one of them is the flower of life. And so just to notice how one circle off a little bit will change the entire structure of everything. But then how afterwards we can go over it with a pencil or a marker or color it in, and how we can kind of adapt something that may have felt imperfect and see the perfection within it. So yeah, that's those are some of the ways that I use art, creativity in my healing approach. But I believe with all of my being that creativity is one of the keys to healing and to integration.
That was so beautifully shared out. I felt like I could walk through a bit of the experience of what might occur in one of the sessions that you share with people, and that helps me as somebody who likes to visualize to be able to see it, and I can see where that makes room for folks to tap into their own wisdom, their own wholeness, their own healing in a different way or a new way than maybe other things that they might have experienced before. And it's so wonderful to get to trust in that creative process and know that the right things will come through. And I would love to get to ask about other healing modalities that you use in your practice or find helpful, or maybe you combine with art therapy. What are some of the modalities that you lean on regularly?
Yeah, well, I'm also a yoga teacher and meditation teacher. So like I mentioned earlier, I usually bring meditation and mindfulness into sessions. And so with that, I'll often use sound healing, so different chimes and crystal bowls, and just allowing someone to recognize what's happening in the body, like, so to really kind of tap into those subtle body sensations. that happens when we connect with our breath and slow down and connect to the space around us. So definitely meditation and mindfulness and yoga. Sometimes too, the workshops I'll do are a mixture of both Kundalini yoga, but other types of yoga. I'm trained as a Kundalini yoga teacher, but find all different yoga modalities and meditations to be supportive for people. And then using somatic experiences. So I was trained in integrative body psychotherapy. And I believe that trauma does live in the body, but so does well-being. So tapping into these feelings and sensations as we're developing that relationship to where things live, and then also creating them at times to have kind of a visual representation of what it is. What we're doing is we're creating a path to that well-being, to help access it when we need to. Because really, when we go offline, when things are, when we're feeling our mental health go offline, when we're needing that extra support, sometimes the last thing that one can remember is, oh, how do I come back, right? How do I access well-being? And so by doing these activities and experiencing these pieces in session, we're creating a pathway that's worn a little deeper each time we do it, so that it can become something automatic that happens to help support people. Another thing I work with and use is dream work and journaling, especially within my psychedelic integration program. Journaling and dream work is super important to understand and access the information, more information from our psychedelic experience. So it's my personal experience too, just by paying attention to my dreams and writing them, that there's so much healing that can be accessed, and wisdom and information that's also coming from within, and tapping us too into other realms when we sleep, right? And we spend a lot of time in our lives sleeping. So if we're able to utilize that space in a way that we just begin paying attention to what our dreams are, maybe we do move into a place where we are able to control pieces within our dreams, or just making art about the dreams afterwards to explore different messages and different healing that might be coming up is super powerful and effective. And like I mentioned too, another main healing modality I use is sacred geometry within my practice.
It's such a wonderful range of options. And I love that you can, with that can meet people and really find what's right for them, meet them where they are. And it's really just inspiring to get to hear about all of the different paths that we can walk to build that link with well-being. I think that is so often, and it goes all the way back to integration. So often we're just trying to solidify that link with our well-being, with our wholeness, so that we can access it in all situations. And I love that you have so many different methods of, inviting people into that space so they can find what's really right for them. That's so beautiful. I'd love to show your website, and just to invite that, I think many people would love to be in touch with you. Do you want to just share what's the best way for folks to reach out, or any insights in that area?
Yeah. Thanks, Jen. Yes, people can reach out by accessing my website there, centeroftheheart.com. So that's spelled CENTRE of theheart.com. And there, you can read a little bit more about me. You can also book a session from there. There's some great resources and links. There's also a link to my psychedelic integration program, which is a 9-module program. It's self-paced. That incorporates sacred geometry, dream work, journaling, neuroscience, yoga, and art therapy. And that can be found through my website, or also just go to courses.centeroftheheart.com. And if anyone was interested in looking at some sacred geometry art too, you can also see some of my work on Etsy at Charmaine Husum Art. So it's been a real pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you, Jen, for the invite. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your time. And for anyone wondering, we'll have all those links in the blog and in the description below this video, so you will be able to access them there. Thank you again for sharing your time. We are so grateful. And I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Blessings.